Joe, I'm Sarah and this is Mbali, and before we came here and we figured out that we were going to interview you, we actually Googled your artwork and noticed that all of it was, or the majority of it on Google was in black and white, and then when we looked in the Mbali books we noticed that the Guess Who Loves You is so different from your normal style or like traditional style that you follow. And I was just wondering, like, what was the inspiration of Guess Who Loves You?
So Guess Who Loves You really came about as a result of noticing how my dog interacted with me and with everything through his toys. And he would look after them very carefully until the squeak went, and then he would just eat them. And I was always interested in this idea that you could love something so much that it would get destroyed. So this was the soccer ball that we photographed, but I'm trying to find, this was the shark, which always reminded me of Damien Hirst's shark. So you can see how big the prints are, because that's the crocodile, and in fact there's not a whole lot. So this is the crocodile in real life versus the size in the photograph. These were kind of like specimens. They were like a secret language. And I had them on a light box, so the light shone from behind them, and then I would photograph them from above. These objects really spoke to me about the way we love across kind of species or across language.
Your work has been exhibited globally, and I was just wondering how you approach the presentation and curation of your artwork in galleries. And yeah.
That's very particular for me. With Guess Who Loves You, I thought if I hang them, so you walk through quite a dark gallery and it's quite ghostly. You know, if you look at something that's in a darkened room with a spotlight, it has a very particular quality. But if you look at them in bright light, it's almost surgical. It's almost like a hospital.
Yeah.
And so these objects become more forensic. Here they become more moody, and they, you know, the things around their strangeness is much more emphasized. When you make them gigantic, every little tooth mark, every little, you know, bite, all of that is very clear. And so the scale, making them big, makes them in a sense more forensic, more examinable.
So your general style of photography is different, and your approach to photography is somewhat different to how it's traditionally done. And I was wondering if you could share your creative process.
A lot of it has to do with personality, actually. So when I started photographing during the 1980s, I was working in the mode that many photographers were working at the time, and it was with black and white, and there was a very strong message at the time about art and photography, about work that really was a commentary on what was happening in South Africa. I remember once in 1986, during the state of emergency, going to Crossroads, and it was after the bulldozers had been and were disappearing everyone's shacks. I can remember photographing this couple, and it was a man and his wife, and she was sitting and he was standing, and they were just looking at what was left. And I thought, I have no idea what that feels like, you know, to just have your house smashed. How can I make a comment, you know? So I had to find other ways of working. Of course, 30 years later, when I'm photographing in Angola, I'm realizing all that time ago I was already photographing the aftermath of the event. And it took me 20 years to really realize that what everyone had teased me about, these empty landscapes, these landscapes that were about nothing, that actually what they really were about was looking at how land or the landscape can speak to the kind of violence or the horror that's taken place on that.
And how do you come up with the idea for the apocalyptic type of feel to your photography? Like, where did that come from?
That's just my dark soul. It's not, it just happens. And I think it's got, you know, it's a lot of it, you know, what you're drawn to. It's about who you are. And I think one of the most important things, you know, that if I think of being, you know, if you are a young artist, is to be yourself. And it's about knowing yourself and being yourself. And I think also it's partly that time. I mean, the 1980s in South Africa was an apocalyptic time. We were at the height of apartheid. The state was, I had friends who were arrested and banned. You think of these continual states of emergency. Even when Mandela was released, I mean, you thought this was going to be a country at war. So, those mad dogs were a way to kind of reflect that. If I couldn't do it in my photography straight, because I still wanted to find a way to work with some kind of relevance. I mean, relevance is a tricky word because it's not about being relevant, but about acknowledging this place in this time.
So you had said earlier that during lockdown you had watched a lot of apocalyptic movies, and I was wondering if that had somewhat inspired you to do like this apocalyptic style in your photography.
So during lockdown, it was interesting for me because, I think if I was an artist in a studio, I could just paint. But if you're a photographer, unless you're a studio photographer, how do you photograph if you can't get out? And a lot of people at the time were photographing their families or interiors. I became fascinated by my computer screen, and a different world opened up during lockdown, whether it was Zoom or like everybody, you're looking at what's happening all over the world. How many people have died here? What is happening in this? All those amazing videos of people sort of across the streets. And then you start thinking of the horror of it, and I remember particularly images in Brazil taken from the air, just these graves and graves that extended. And then I thought, why not make a film? So I started photographing my screen. And out of my archive of toy camera footage, actually, I had a lot of these funny pictures, also pictures of Luanda just after the war. And I'd photographed on set of Yezo Yezo, and there was a funeral. So I just went literally into all my negative files, and I managed to find these strips of film. These are photographs with my Holga camera, which is another toy camera. People don't realize about photography, an aperture is round, and you have light coming through this little pinhole. If you didn't have any restrictions here, the photograph would actually be round. But what we have is we break the format so we have a square. If you take this out, you've got the limit top and bottom, but you can bleed out. So if you look at, say, something like this, for example, you can see where, if there was the right space, that would be the round hole. That would be the round hole. So it's called a vignette. So this was a whole film, a whole world just made here. Yeah. And it was really exciting.
What it sounds like to me is lockdown kind of gave you a lot of inspiration, a lot of things to think about and to look at, whereas with other artists it was kind of, it put them in a slump. For you it was like, I found something that like interests me and it's in my space.
Look, I think I was really lucky because you just can, if you've got the material, so whatever your form is and you work alone, that's easy. But imagine if you were a performer or a singer or a dancer where you are having to work with an audience. I mean, that lockdown was shattering for those artists, I mean, I think it was shattering for a lot of the world because of businesses. So I was extremely lucky that I had a way of working and I had a way of thinking, that could support making something out of like a really horrible situation. Yeah. That's the critical thing, is to find a way to be both resourceful and resilient.